Hello again. In this session, we'll be finding out why capitalist production is a system at war with itself. In this session, we'll introduce historic evidence of the decline in the rate of profit. Then we'll examine what the rate of profit actually measures, Marx's explanation for the decline, how the decline is responsible for the drive to growth, and the contradictory pressures on investment that drive the inevitability of crisis. And then we'll look at the additional impact of COVID. There can be little doubt that the capitalist system's in trouble. Profitability, productivity, and capital investment have been falling for decades. In the attempt to keep the system alive, the amount of credit pumped into all sectors of the economy, that's corporations, governments, and households, has ballooned. As capitalist corporations have extended their production and markets throughout the world, the system as a whole has experienced a worsening series of cataclysmic economic and financial crises affecting more people in more countries than ever before. Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall helps to explain the inescapable problems that engulf capitalist society with increasing force. You may be aware that this is controversial. Many economists, even those who otherwise profess to be Marxist, don't agree with it. But we won't be going into all the arguments against it in this short course. Marx himself thought that it, the LTRPF, was his greatest discovery, so I'll try to explain it simply. Measured by the rate of profit, the capitalist world system has been in decline for quite some time, despite some periods of recovery. This graph tracks the decline from the late 1960s in the rich G20 countries, and this from earlier in the 1950s, but from a much higher rate in the so-called emerging markets, which include China and India. For an economy that exists to make and distribute profits, things haven't been looking too rosy for quite some time. Both the rate of profit and the quantity have been in a nosedive for decades, as you can see in these graphs. While the neoliberal assault on regulation in the 80s and 90s and the period of austerity following the 2008 crash had some effect, it was only temporary. Nothing, it seems, can stop the rut. Not even with interest rates at or below zero and the invention of eye-watering injections of new credit under many schemes like quantitative easing. A few companies have made a great deal, but globally, capitalist production looks to be heading towards being a loss-making operation. But what is the rate of profit and how is it measured? Last time we discovered that profit itself is appropriated from workers as unpaid labour. We looked at how the amount of profit can be increased or decreased. And the increasing or decreasing the amount of profit made from the process of producing and selling commodities is the subject of the struggle between workers and employers. Investors are, of course, interested in getting the best bang for their buck, maximizing the return on their investment. They're always looking not just at the quantity of profit, but at the percentage return to see whether they could do better elsewhere. The calculation of the rate of profit and its importance for the rest of the story make it easier to understand if we resort to a little algebra. Otherwise known as the return on investment, the rate of profit, P, compares the amount of profit or surplus value, S, to C, the total amount invested, where C is the total amount of invested in variable capital or labour, that's V, plus the amount invested in fixed capital or C. So P equals S over C or OS over V plus C. And as you can probably or hopefully see here, if the proportion of investment in technology, that's fixed capital, increases, but the amount on labour and the surplus value remains the same, the rate of profit must decline. If you don't get it yet, don't worry, we'll have another try in a little while. Now let's look back further to see what's been happening since Marx discovered his law in the 1860s. As you can see from available figures, since the 1870s, despite ups and downs, the average rate of profit in so-called core countries has been in decline. This graph, incidentally, is borrowed from a paper titled, hopefully, The Historical Transience of Capital. So, although there are many who argue with the law, as you can see, the evidence looks to be irrefutable. It happens. But why, oh why? The simple answer is that, as we saw in the last session, competition in the marketplace forces capitalist producers to reduce the prices they charge. And this forces them to compete for the investment which they hope will give them the edge, if only temporarily, helping them to drive up productivity and so reduce the cost of production, so that they can then reduce the price and sell more of their products, attracting more revenue overall. But whilst it reduces prices, it also drives down the rate of profit. That's because relatively fewer workers, or more precisely, fewer hours of labour power, are put to work as the only source of value. So the ratio of fixed to variable capital tips towards fixed capital, and the proportion of investment spent on workers declines. And because it's only living, breathing workers that contribute surplus value, that means that the proportion of investment that creates surplus value declines, and so the rate of profit declines too. And whilst it has its ups and downs, this is the dominant effect. Just to reinforce the point, the ratio of investment in fixed or constant capital to the amount invested in labour or variable capital tips towards machines, which, because they generate no new value, contribute nothing to profit, so the rate of profit falls. At the same time, increasing the volume of production in a day without increasing the quantity of labour reduces the number of minutes or hours, and therefore the amount of new value each box embodies or carries. In due course, as the price falls, many more units must be sold to maintain overall income and the overall quantity of profit. More and more boxes must be churned out to keep shareholders happy and on board. So corporations which are constantly having to increase investment find themselves running up the down escalator of a reducing rate of profit. And that means that growth in both the amount invested and the units produced becomes absolutely essential to maintain, let alone increase, the overall amount of profit. This is the nub of the problem of a capitalism. It's why GDP, the measure of growth, became the primary indicator of the health of the capitalist economy following the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. But there's a limit. There's always a limit. At a certain point, the rate of profit sinks to such a low level it becomes pointless to continue investing. So investment slows, as it has done since the 1970s, and especially since the 2008 crash. Meanwhile, many formerly profitable countries have turned into zombies, unable to generate enough income to service their debt, let alone turn a profit. If the rate of investment falls, so the rate of economic growth must follow and slow. All these longer-term measures of slowing tell us that the system as a whole is aging. Measures to offset the effects and causes of the decline become more drastic and less potent by the day, often reinforcing their own impotence. Let's take a closer look at the profound impact of this decline. The following are key points from the World Bank's 2020 report, Global Productivity Trends, Drivers and Policies. You're unlikely to find a more authoritative assessment of the dire state of the global capitalist economy anywhere. Let's take this piece by piece. The global slowdown had been underway for a decade after the 2008 crash, and well before COVID appeared. The slowdown was widespread and dramatic. The deceleration in emerging markets and developing economies was the steepest, longest, and most synchronized since 1970. Because of and since the global financial crisis, many factors have deepened the slowdown. Working age population growth has decelerated, educational attainment has stagnated, the pace of expansion has lost momentum. Natural disasters, wars, and major economic disruptions have tended to be accompanied by a large and protracted decline in investment and labour productivity. When the bank talks about adverse implications of the pandemic for productivity, they're really talking about profitability. Take a look for yourself at some of what they say. Actually, in the UK, it was the worst recession since records began, with GDP crashing more than 20%, worse than any other of the rich G7 countries and worse than in the EU. The International Monetary Fund, which is the sister organisation of the World Bank, said the pandemic had plunged the world into a crisis like no other. When they talk about an erosion of human capital, shifts in the labour markets, they're really talking about the declining availability of skilled workers, which has been a feature of the, albeit limited, recovery. And more recent reports looking at the impact of COVID on debt use phrases like stands apart in the experience of the past half-century and exceptional by historical standards. We'll be looking more at debt later in the course. And finally, COVID-19 induced recessions may further strain corporate and public sector balance sheets, by which they mean it's not going to improve anytime soon. What needs to be done according to the World Bank? They say there's no silver bullet, and then offer up the usual list of measures, all designed to return the economy to planet-killing growth. Even if achievable, all these would be catastrophic for the majority in so many ways. To end this session, let's very briefly look at what Marxist economist Michael Roberts has to say. COVID has left permanent scarring of economies. The policy tools of governments will be inadequate to restore prosperity for all. We need to reset the economy through public control and ownership of the means of production, with a global plan aimed at social objectives, not private profit. We'll be unpicking what that could mean later in the course. This could be a good moment to delve into Marx's detailed explanation of his law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. You'll find it in chapters 13, 14 and 15 in volume 3 of Capital, and that's available free at marxist.org. Or you could search out some of the other, perhaps simpler explanations, for example, Hadastia in A People's Guide to Capitalism. In the following session, we'll explore what can and has been done to counteract the tendency to crisis, and to what extent these counteracting measures have been successful.